any titles for next year, but we're doing pretty well. So this is the lineup for the next, for 3/4 of our 2-year series on health, disease, and environment. So we start today, well, we have, I think in that 2-year lineup, or year-and-a-half lineup, we have 4 papers on plague. Starting today. So it's a plague, well, I'm talking houses and things like that. It really looks like it's going to be a very, very interesting series. We start today in our series this spring and in our plague series with Nukhet Varlik from Rutgers, with a paper on plague and post-Black Death, medieval and Ottoman world. We will also have a comment by Carter Finley, and I'm just going to quickly introduce Carter, and then not so quickly introduce Nukhet with a little more detail, and then we will open things up to roughly, what, about 15 minutes, you know, of context and situating the paper that we've all read, and about 5-10 minutes of kind of situating from Carter's view of the world, and then we have an hour or so, probably more, to talk about the paper. So first of all, Carter Finley, humanities distinguished professor of history in our department, a historian of world reputation in Islamic civilization, especially the Ottoman Empire. Perfect connection. Past president of the World History Association, Turkish Studies Association, a variety of honors, NEH, Guggenheim, ACLS, SRC. It sounds like little initials. It goes after honors. Most importantly, 4 major books in Ottoman history: bureaucratic reform in the Ottoman Empire, Ottoman civil officialdom, a social history, the Turks in world history, prize-winning book, Turkey, Islam, Nationalism, and Modernity, which came out in 2010. Nukhet is in her second year at Rutgers, having spent 2 years at James Madison and then moving on to New Jersey. She got her MA in Istanbul and moved on to a PhD at the University of Chicago, and has been working on the plague, perhaps, maybe, thinking about the plague for a very long time. I'll let you tell your stories, but well, we heard stories last night that suggested that it might be in your dreams. And a series of wonderful material out of massive research in Ottoman archives on the 15th and 16th century, what was once a black hole, an empty space, a knowledge of the plague, articles including contiguous metaphors, ideas of transmission in early modern Ottoman society, plague and contagion in the Islamic Mediterranean. That's the book going in. That's the article going into that book, and then plague, conflict, negotiation, the Jewish weavers, the Slavonic and Ottoman central administration in the late 16th century, about which we heard a wonderful synthesis today. She's putting together the book I just mentioned, Plague and Contagion in the Islamic Mediterranean, coming out in...
That's the collection, Plague and Empires.
Right, an edited collection. And a book in process with Cambridge, Plague and Empire in the Early Modern Mediterranean World, the Ottoman Experience, 1347 to 1600, which is the basis for our paper today, Plague Epidemics in Post-Black Death Mediterranean and the Ottoman Empire. I'm going to just fiddle with the lights, as you can have something so we have just the right button. You're on.
Okay, great, wonderful. Well, let me just start by thanking you, and thank you so much for inviting me here to the seminar series, and I also would like to thank Professor Finley and accepting to comment on my work, and of course thank you all for being here, and it's just a wonderful opportunity being here and sharing my work with you. And earlier actually today we had a wonderful occasion of discussing my work with graduate students, so that's just, I'm very, very happy to be here. I'll start with talking a little bit about this paper and in where it stands in my larger research. As Professor Vrubel mentioned, I worked on the history of plague epidemics in the early modern Ottoman Empire, focusing mostly on from the 14th to the 16th century, and I like to talk a little bit about the paper you have on hand today, and then hopefully I will try to put it in context for you. And what I am going to do mostly is talk about the impact of the expansion of the empire on the spread of disease, but I'll be happy to talk about the impact of plague on the empire, perhaps in the question and answer section. So my work focuses on the relationship between empire and plague in the example of the early modern Ottoman Empire, and I focus on the post-Black Death epidemics until the end of the 16th century, but most specifically on the epidemics of plague between the mid-15th century to the end of the 16th century. And I would like to start by showing you this map. It worked here. Which I have. It seems it is based on the findings that I have on the spread of plague and pointing out different trajectories of contamination of outbreaks of plague in mostly eastern Mediterranean world. And the arrows we see here point out the spread of the infection in the Ottoman lands from the mid-15th to the end of the 16th century. As you see, the map looks quite complicated. I don't even know how much you can see from there behind, but we have a lot of arrows and like a plague going back and forth between places. Of course, I mean, this is the state of affairs that basically emerges by the end of the 16th century, and this is kind of the basic core of the trajectories of contamination that takes place at this time, but it also carries into the later centuries. That is to say, this is probably the core of the patterns of contamination of plague that affected the Ottoman lands into the 17th, 18th, and the 19th centuries. And of course, for this to arrive to this picture, I had to dig in the Ottoman archives and go through thousands of archival documents and of course not only archival but also narrative sources as well, trying to find where plague took place, how it spread, how long it lasted, how many people it killed, and so trying to get the basics out. So I must point out that there is no systematic study of outbreaks of plague in the Ottoman Empire covering the outbreaks of plague before the year 1700. So basically anything that happened up to the end of the 17th century is unknown, is a black hole. So this map hopefully will guide us through the developments taking place and how this is things are shaping up in the time leading to this time period. Starting with the Black Death itself, the mid-14th century outbreak, we have little indication that it affected the regions ruled by the Ottomans. And of course, we also have to think about the dynamics of the expansion of the Ottoman polity itself. On this map, we see different colored areas showing the expansion of the land holdings of the Ottomans. And so, as you can see, starting in a very, very small location at the turn of the 14th century, and then gradually expanding in northwestern Anatolia, and then moving toward the Balkans, and then expanding more into Anatolia, and then gradually expanding more into the Balkans and Anatolia, and then finally we reach very big scale expansion around the Mediterranean world by the 16th century and onwards. So, of course, you know, when looking at the expansion of plague or spread of plague, I also want you to follow with me the expansion, the territorial expansion of the empire itself, because it is expanding as plague expanding. But of course, you know, the challenge is how to make sense of the expansion of the empire and spread of plague. You know, are they just, is there a pattern, is there a connection, is there a relationship between the two, or are just randomly happening bursts of plague? So, I mean, I was of course driven to understand if there was a relationship between the expansion of the empire and the spread of plague. It seems that on the basis of my research findings, plague did take place according to a pattern, and especially starting with the mid-15th century, we can make some sense of the occurrences of plague in Ottoman lands, and we can categorize outbreaks of plagues into different phases. It seems that both the trajectories of contamination and the frequency of occurrences of outbreaks seem to follow a model, if we can say, in the 150 years that is between the conquest of Constantinople in 1453 to the end of the 16th century. And I have to emphasize how important it was for the Ottomans to conquer Constantinople, not only for the expansion of the empire and also related to the political reasons, but also for new experiences of plague, because with the conquest of the city, the Ottoman lands were exposed to new patterns of new trajectories of contamination, as Istanbul was located at the intersection of several trade routes. So it seems at the time of the Black Death itself, since the Ottomans were occupying a very small area, we don't clearly know what happened during the Black Death, the initial outbreak of Black Death in the mid-14th century, but it seems there is some indication that Ottoman cities, especially Bursa, was affected by this outbreak. And from the mid-14th to the mid-15th century, we have a few occurrences of plague, but it's really difficult to make sense of the patterns of contamination during this period. And I believe really the conquest of Constantinople is key in understanding the changes in the spread of plague and its frequency of repetition. So I will just introduce you the main phases of plague spread in the time between the conquest of Constantinople, 1453, to the 16th century, and then I will try to show you in maps how these phases represent different trajectories of contamination, and then hopefully that will take us to the final map that I started out with. So in what I call the first phase of spread, and you also read it in the paper, we see that plague is introduced to Ottoman areas from mainly the Mediterranean ports of Europe. Basically, Venice is the main area that sends plague to Ottoman cities, and so it seems that in the period, the first phase between 1453 to 1517, it seems plague seems to come to Ottoman cities, especially Istanbul, from Venice, either by the sea or following the overland caravan routes, the main routes of the Balkans, and so mostly from Venice to Ragusa, we see either traveling over sea and then following the overland routes, or coming from the main caravan routes of the Balkans. But this is the case especially for the first wave of outbreaks in the first phase, and the significant thing about it is that we see that plague is now taking place in this east-west axis of contamination. And once it reaches Istanbul and Edirne and some of the northwestern cities of Anatolia, it doesn't seem to spread much further into Anatolia. But in the outbreak after this one, there is some indication that Anatolian cities are now slowly being integrated to this network. But when we move on to the next phase, that is to say the outbreaks of plague that I grouped under the second phase is 1517 to 1570, we see the introduction of new trajectories of contamination, new networks of plague. And one of the most significant ones introduced in this phase is, of course, comes immediately after the Ottoman conquest of Syria and Egypt in 1516 and 1517, and we see a direct connection between Egypt and Istanbul. And this is, I want to emphasize this because this connection becomes really important for the circulation of plague back and forth between Istanbul and Cairo. So much so that some people will actually in Istanbul speculate that plague comes from Egypt and perhaps vice versa in Cairo. Again, the reason I want to emphasize this is that before this period, before the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople, Ottoman conquest of Egypt, we don't see a direct circulation of plague between these 2 points. Even when we have plague in both locations, it seems they are both getting their infection from the western Mediterranean ports. And again, mostly Venice, but other places as well. So there is no direct connection between the two. So again, this connection emerges immediately after the Ottoman conquest of Syria and Egypt, and also Ottoman conquest of Rhodes is an important step to be mentioned here in 1522. And so we see the introduction of a north-south axis in the Mediterranean. And shortly afterwards, we see that this new axis will be integrated to the east-west axis. Another network that emerges during this period is a network that connected Anatolian cities. During the course of the 16th century, Anatolian cities grew, and we see the emergence of many new cities, and we see the transformation of insignificant towns into more prominent urban areas. And also we need to mention that urbanization is something that is taking place during the course of the 16th century, and that has an impact on the spread of plague. And of course, this Anatolian network was quickly integrated to the east-west and the south-north axes in the Mediterranean world. Another network of plague that develops in the second phase, that's say between 1517 to 1570, is a Black Sea network. And so we see with this connection being established, especially between Crimea and Istanbul, we not only see the introduction of plague directly from these locations between each other, but also this route became important for transporting plague to Istanbul from the hinterland, the Central Asian hinterland of Crimea. And this was also an important pilgrimage route for the Central Asian pilgrims coming to Istanbul and then being integrated to the northwest axis in the eastern Mediterranean. So just in a nutshell, I think perhaps we can just see an integration of the different networks of plague and the different trajectories for the spread of plague that emerges during this period. And so we are faced with a rather complicated patterns of contamination that gave way to rather severe and extended outbreaks. So in the third phase, basically, when we see this complicated patterns of contamination from 1570 onwards, and I also need to, I want to make a note that in 1570 we see the beginning of one of the greatest outbreaks of the 16th century, and not only in Ottoman cities, but this is also the case for other Mediterranean ports of Europe. Starting from 1570, plague is in Istanbul and other Ottoman cities almost every year, and it doesn't stop for several decades. and it continues into the end of the 16th century and into the early decades of the 17th century. So it's a major wave of plague that devastates Ottoman cities. So overall, even though I stopped my research in the 1600s looking at outbreaks of plague, I see that it continues in this basic pattern into the early years of 17th century and further. So looking at this, I just want to point out like 3 key themes that I think help us understand the connection between plague and empire, and especially how the emergence and expansion of an early modern empire had an impact on the spread of plague. And one of the things, obviously, as we can see here, is conquest. As the Ottoman lands expanded, as there was new conquest, the integration of new areas into Ottoman land holdings exposed them to new trajectories of plague and new experiences of plague. So I think conquest is one of the key elements in understanding this relationship between plague and empire. And the second element is the networks of trade and communication. Clearly, they are the main conduits of plague in this picture. And as new lands were conquered, we see the implementation of new connections between places that were not directly connected before, the building of roads and other infrastructure activities, and so places, the different individual locations of the empire now are brought together in a network that combined them with each other. So not only the empire conquered these areas, but also imposed a structure to bring them together, to bring them into communication, and that, I guess, facilitated the spread of plague. And the last factor that I want to point out here is urbanization. And clearly here we see that, of course, plague is affecting urban centers, but at the same time we hear more about what's happening in the urban centers than in the rural areas, of course, perhaps as a prejudice of the sources, so we know more about what happens in the urban centers than rural areas. But urbanization seems to be connected to this development. We see an incredible increase in the urban population of the empire, and this the increase of population and urbanization seems to go hand in hand with the development and spread of plague. I think I'll just stop here, and I'll be happy to answer questions and we can talk more about, but I'll try to stop here. Thank you. So, I don't know, would I change it?
Well, I would like to just say a few brief things. Those of us who work in the field of Ottoman studies always feel as if we're playing catch up with scholars in other fields. The European historians in particular are always just doing all kinds of new cutting edge stuff and exploring new avenues, and we have all of these sources, immense amounts of archival and manuscript sources, but they're difficult to access, and there's all kinds of institutional problems about working the field and numbers of people doing the work and this kind of thing. So it seems like we're always playing catch up. And one of the exciting new vectors in this process of catch up is the recent growth of studies of environment and disease. And just to put this in a little bit in sort of chronological perspective, those of us who follow the literature on world history have read and been inspired by the work of William McNeill, Plagues and Peoples, for a very long time. And more recently, scholars like Alfred Crosby have sensitized us to a whole larger range of issues that have to do with the creation of an integrated Afro-Eurasian disease pool, and indeed, in his phrase, a portmanteau biota. And he says if he was writing the book again, since students nowadays don't know what a portmanteau was, he would call it a duffel bag biota. This mobile biological complex, including people, technologies, pathogens, animals, weeds, seeds stuck to their boots, germs, all this kind of stuff that enabled, well, in the specific case, Europeans after a certain period to subdue the rest of the world. But of course, if the Chinese had sailed across the Pacific before Columbus sailed across the Atlantic, it would have probably been the Chinese that would have decimated everybody else. And indeed they may yet, but in that case they would have done it 500 years earlier. And now coming in more into the Ottoman arena, well, one of the things we can see already in McNeil's work is that Black Sea route. He of course emphasized the role of the Mongols in creating a unified disease pool in Eurasia and transmitting the plague bacillus from, I think he believes they actually got it originally in someplace in Southeast Asia when fleas jumped onto their horses, and then they rode off to Central Asia, and the fleas jumped off and got into the burrowing rodents in Central Asia. That was the latest version I heard from him the last time I discussed it with him. But as far as transmitting it to Europe in the 14th century, supposedly it was sent from Kaffa in the Crimea to Genoa, which would have meant that the ship would have passed Istanbul for sure. And indeed, 14th century sources tell us that there was plague in Constantinople and in Divrii in Anatolia, which means it must have been in places in between as well. Now, looking on into the period on Ottoman history, we have some precursors for the work that's now going on about this. In Ottoman or other aspects of Islamic studies, Michael Dole's wrote the pioneering work on plague in the Middle East, focusing on Egypt. And then the French scholar Daniel Ponzac devoted a large part of his career to the study of the plague and demographic issues in Ottoman times, I think relying essentially on the archival resources from the Archives de la Chambre de Commerce de Marseille. It's of course a very profuse body of archival evidence, but largely independent of the Ottoman sources. And then more recently, the people who are really doing this work nowadays are, to my knowledge, the names that come to mind today, other than Nukhet Varlik herself, are Sam White up at Oberlin, who's really working on environmental history in the 17th century, but it gets into disease in connection with that. And also Alan Mikhail, who's now at Yale, who's done a book about the environmental history of the Nile Valley in Egypt. And of course, this takes him into disease, among other topics. There are some questions that have sort of been on my mind. I tried to communicate with Sam White about some of this. The connection with your work on the plague is maybe not so transparent, but it certainly relates to the environmental issues. One of the things I think people need to at least people who work on the environment need to pay more attention to is the fact that this, or at least the area between sort of southeastern Turkey and parts of Syria and maybe Palestine, is supposedly where wheat-based agriculture was invented 9,000 years ago. And it has a very long history of agricultural exploitation. And then, of course, animal husbandry and nomadism came in there. And you have, among other things, a situation where in the 1930s, around country towns in Anatolia, there were lots of places where you could not find any plant growth over 1 meter high. I know a memoirist who worked in the village institutes of that period who says that about a place just inland from Izmir. It would not at all have been unique. And of course, this has a lot to do with environmental degradation resulting from overexploitation. It's not so much relevant to your topic as to the kinds of things that Sam White works on. Of course, another thing that comes into play here is the sort of long-term cyclical movements in economies and demographic trends. One of the things that would subtend possibly the development of these networks you're talking about in the 16th century is the fact that the 16th century was essentially a long economic and demographic uptrend, which would have increased all kinds of interactions, you know, human densities, consequently human interactions, the movements of ships and caravans and rats and fleas, and all of those things that went along together. Now, another let me see, the creation of imperial conquest and the creation of cities, the growth of cities, the problems of maintaining public health conditions in pre-modern cities, the factors that would have tended to turn any cities before the mid-1800s really into demographic death traps. Those are, of course, obviously relevant to all of this, and you have talked about some of that. Now, some other issues that I find in the literature about this are, well, one of them is the issue of whether there's something different about Muslim responses to the plague. Was there such a thing as some kind of Muslim fatalism, or some concept or understanding of disease that looked like that to outsiders? And another is what diseases are we talking about when we deal with these historical sources? Sam White, for example, thinks that Daniel Ponzac is too quick to assume that every epidemic disease is, you know, bubonic plague. So those are just some of the issues that are sloshing around in here, and these are things that we can open up and explore in the question period, and of course that will also give Nukhet opportunity to say how she feels her work relates to everybody else's and how it adds to and goes beyond and so forth. So I'll stop there in the interest of letting other people talk more. You want me to take that away?
So we'll open the floor. You want to comment quickly?
Yeah, or do you want me to wait for the questions? Either way.
Either way. Well, why don't we open things up?
I just thought that I liked the paper a lot, and thought the way you drew the periods out. I was wondering if you could say more about what is particularly Ottoman about the plague in this period, in this place, and what would describe, how this would be described from some other empire forming at the same time. Because if we talk about urbanization, we talk about conquest, we talk about the themes that you draw out, those would seem to apply to almost any imperial situation. And so I was wondering if you could tease out perhaps some of the particularities of the Ottoman case.
Okay, sure. I'd be happy to address that question. And I think it's a wonderful question because, you know, and it also in a way reflects my perspective on the issue, because I see the model that I try to develop in trying to understand how the expansion of the Ottoman Empire helped spread plague is kind of as part of an attempt that I'm trying to develop as part of understanding how the early modern state formation and early modern empire formation can be understood as a tool for understanding spread of disease. And earlier on today we were discussing that perhaps this was not so much different from other imperial examples like the Safavids or the Mughals or perhaps even other imperial formations. So I clearly see there a link, and in this regard, I can say that the Ottoman model or example is just constituting one way of understanding this relationship. But if you're asking me what's particular to the Ottoman case, and I would suggest with some confidence that the reverse part of the relationship is what is particular to the Ottoman case, and in that I am trying to point out to the relationship between disease and empire, but more looking at how the experience of plague shaped or transformed the Ottoman Empire itself. And in that, I did not talk about the issue in the paper here, but I see some ways in which the Ottoman experience of plague, and even now the more heightened experience of plague, shaped the Ottoman society. I think both popular and scholarly responses to plague changed during this time period, perhaps because the disease becoming more familiar or just becoming part of their life, part of their urban experience. But in addition to this, I see a change in the interpretation of Muslim legal scholars, and in that perhaps we can address the issue of fatalism and whether, we can discuss whether there is a Muslim response to plague. And also, I think there is also indication that the Ottomans, at least to a limited extent, tried to implement a new way of dealing with the problem of plague, and in a way, I think to me it represents a pre-modern or early modern public health systems, for the lack of a better word. Of course, I'm not speaking of a public health system in the modern sense, but there is some sense in which the state, as it is growing, is now trying to control in what is going on in the urban space, and trying to monitor and control and perhaps take precautions against cases of plague. And of course, it also relates to your question of whether we can talk about public health measures in Ottoman cities during this time and how efficient they were. Of course, these are all questions that we need to deal with. I can go in more detail in discussing those issues, or we can move on to other questions. I don't know, depending on how it seems appropriate.
Regarding we should all, I should just say, this was Dodi McDowell, and we should all introduce ourselves.
Okay.
Yeah.
My name is Nirvana Buzov. I teach Turkish and Islamic studies here at the Language Department. And I'm also Nukhet's colleague from the University of Chicago. You mentioned how actually that you're equally interested in how plague shaped the perceptions or the life of the empire as much as you're interested in how the empire was. So I would be particularly interested in the sources that you use, how they, those that we call narrative, the chronicles, how they narrate or just record instances of plague, and also those documents that you use from the Ottoman Central Administration Directory. What's the language, like their terminology, and what, I mean, how you know they're talking about plague and not some other epidemics?
Sure,
kind of
sure.
thing.
Okay, let me then
And also,
talk a little bit
I just want to, and who, whether these are the orders issued by Sultan to whom, whether these are letters or instructions to Qadis or whatever. What came to my mind when I read your paper is that there were, of course, in the Eastern Adriatic, in the ports of Eastern Adriatic, which were Venetian, there were Ottoman iskelets. Right? So there was Ottoman official in every port. And all of these ports had lazarettos. And I also, before I came here, I checked the Ottoman dictionary to see if there is lazaretto in every Ottoman dictionary that I looked at. So as it was written, in Arabic script, but Italian. And so in the sense of the sources, official orders of sultanic decrees, whatever else, what's the vocabulary that these are orders issued to some extent? We know that Ottoman Sultan easily closed all of the ports when there was war, or any incident in the Mediterranean. He would just send the decrees all over the empire, said no selling, buying, So were there such things in their books
Okay.
regarding that.
So that will give me opportunity to talk about my sources, which I love, and also the issue of terminology. Perhaps I'll start with the terminology, and I think this is like a central issue in identifying what the disease that we're dealing with here. It was basically in the sources, the two main terms emerged, and one of them is ta'un, and the other one is waba. It seems that they were using the term ta'un in both medical and popular language to refer to specifically bubonic plague that also took the form of pneumonic plague in some cases. But when they use the term waba, I believe they are referring to epidemic disease in general of non-specific description. But of course the problem is when they use both of them at the same time, which they use, which is the rhetoric of the language of talking that there was like ta'un and waba at the same time. That's when things really get complicated. But you would see like a great ta'un ekber, or ta'un kabir sometimes, and when there is a big outbreak of plague. So. But of course, there's always this question of we don't want to do the retrospective diagnosis, and how do we know that when they use the term ta'un that they are referring to bubonic plague? How are we going to really know that that's what they had in mind? I have a few sources of evidence for this, and the first is even before the Ottomans, when we look at the medical sources written in Arabic language, medical sources representing the Islamic medical tradition, it seems that there is consensus in using the term ta'un with reference to bubonic plague and waba as a general epidemic disease of general sort. And it seems that this consensus continued over time, and it is, I think, pretty clear that when they use ta'un, they really mean what we mean about plague. Medical treatises refer to the symptoms of the disease and very specific descriptions of the plague buboes. And in a way, I have a feeling that if the society has had the exposure to a disease like bubonic plague, it's very difficult to miss it for another disease with such significant symptoms. So I think in that we can pretty much make sure that when they use the term ta'un, they refer to bubonic plague. When we move on to the language of the sources, especially the official sources of the state, and here I mean the Muhimme registers are the registers of important affairs that I surveyed for with the hope of finding references to cases of plague. I must say, first of all, they are very useless when it comes to problem of plague. I basically surveyed and looked at about 100,000 documents covering the 16th century, especially the second part of the 16th century, and I found about 30 cases of plague, or at least about 30 documents that mentions plague. So overall, it was very not a very useful attempt to look for cases of plague. But overall, I mean, the Ottoman sources don't talk about plague much. Let me try to tell you what kinds of sources I work with in general, and the key I really found in using different types of sources in conjunction with each other. I can never get the full picture from one type of source only. So like the two general categories of sources that I have is one group archival sources, and in that I use mainly Muhimme registers, but also other documents issued by the state that are kept in the Prime Minister archives in Istanbul today. In addition to those documents, I also worked in Topkapı Palace archives, and they were I had some interesting findings about the cases of plague in the Topkapı Palace archives, because they can tell us about things that happened before the dating before the documents kept in the Prime Minister records, that is to say, about the early 16th century cases of plague. In addition to this, I used also court registers, the Qadr sijils, even though I did not make a systematic study of them because they're mostly on catalog. But so whenever they were mentioned in secondary sources, kept records of the court registers as well. And my narrative sources are mainly plague treatises, and they are almost entirely unpublished in manuscript form, and these are medical and legal discussions of plague, and the earliest examples of the genre date back to the mid-15th century, and I used all the examples that I could find until 16th century and even further on. And of course I also used historical sources, chronicles and accounts of travelers, ambassadorial reports, and historical calendars and book inventories among the sources that I can think of now. And so, but the really important thing that I believe is to remember here is that it's almost impossible to get the whole picture by using one type of source. Because, for instance, if I were to base myself entirely on the archival evidence, because it only gives the perspective of the state, there is very little evidence to show about the presence of plague. At the same time, narrative sources have their own problem. For instance, the early chronicles of the Ottoman century, and the earliest ones date back to the late 15th century, they don't really talk about plague much. There is very little mention of plague, and in fact this is in itself a very interesting question, is that, why do the early Ottoman chronicles don't talk about plague? There's no mention of the disease. In fact, you can see that disease is affecting them, and yet they will not talk about the plague. And that's, a question, like, why? For instance, they will only mention the plague, and I'm talking about like the 15th century, early 16th century Ottoman chroniclers. They will only mention plague, not because it's an interesting fact to mention that affected urban life, but only when it affected the imperial family, the dynastic family. If somebody from either the dynastic family or somebody affiliated with the dynastic family, or somebody of rank, died of plague, or when it caused a difference in shifting the route of a military campaign, or when it caused the soldiers to be moved to a different place. But then, later on, of course, when I was able to integrate different types of sources with each other, and when I knew, for instance, that there was plague in a certain location that the chronicler is writing about, then it was possible to discover some of the little clues that are not mentioned in the sources. For instance, they will talk about how the Sultan and the court went to the mountains over the summer. And so, that's a clear indication that there was plague and they're trying to avoid plague. But they will not mention it openly and clearly. So that's an additional problem. And in fact, perhaps it's kind of what everything goes back to, because it's kind of commonplace among Ottomanist scholarship that whatever that the sources talk about, we tend to talk about those issues. But when the source doesn't talk about it, what do you do about that problem? You just need to develop a way of going around that problem. And so, so basically, I guess, I don't know, maybe there's more to say, because when you ask about how the language of the administrative documents is, some of the cases of plague that found their way into the official documents, they are mostly about cases of plague taking place in the provinces, and they are petitioning the center about an issue related to plague, and that's how we hear about the case of plague. And we hear the response of the plague, of the central administration to the provinces. So sometimes we can hear what happened in the province by the summary of the petition in the decision, the order itself, but not much about how it affected social life. Sometimes they will ask for reduction of taxes or some, tax immunity, and they would be granted or not. But it's just a very little evidence of how it affected people's lives. So it's really frustrating. I mean,
You mentioned legal treatises about the plague. How do people come to write legal treatises about plague? Medical treatises, I think we can all understand that. Why are there legal treatises about
Well, these are mostly, I mean, the scholars writing them are religious scholars, and it so happens that almost all of the important Shaykh al-Islam, the jurisconsults in the 16th century, did write about plague. For instance, I have an important plague treatise written by Kemal Paşazade, another important plague treatise written about Taşköprüzade. Also, Ebu Suud commented on plague. So we hear the perspective of the religious and legal scholars about how one should conduct himself in times of plague. So I mean, in addition to writing about the origins and spread of disease, they also wrote about what is the proper way of conduct for a Muslim at times of plague. And it also goes back to an earlier tradition of the genre. Even in the Mamluk sources, we see it in the work of Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, Suyuti. So there is like an understanding of a proper way of conduct for a Muslim. And because it can be translated into more practical side of disease, perhaps that's why it was more...
Well, what are some of these more practical things that a good Muslim was supposed to do?
Okay, so let me talk about that then. I think the Ottoman experience is very significant because I can see a significant change in how, a significant change in the perception of plague and a significant change in how, what one should do at times of plague. According to a more classical or conventional understanding of what a Muslim should do at times of plague, we see in earlier sources, in earlier Muslim sources, that one should not leave the city where there is plague, and one should remain inside. And this goes back to the earlier prophetic traditions, and there is a lot of controversy about this issue within the Muslim world itself, because we know that people did flee the plague, Muslims as well as non-Muslims, and so flight was one of the first method that at least the ones who could do it, and that most of the time those were upper classes, but flight was a common practice. But at the same time, religious scholars are trying to convince people, or finding a way of telling them that they should not flee the plague. And so, in doing so, they try to present ways of how and why this was not permissible according to the Sharia, according to Islamic law, that one should stay where plague is, and it was not permissible from the standard of Islamic law that that flight should not be permissible. But this changes with Taşköprüzade. I think there are indications that this was already moving in that direction with the work of İdris Bitlisi and Kemal Paşazade, but it really reaches its climax with the work of Taşköprüzade sometime in the mid-16th century. He compiled all the contemporary knowledge about plague, and he's not only using medical, religious sources, but he's also combining the medical literature and integrating the recent medical findings in plague. But he basically draws the conclusion that one can leave the city where there is plague, and I really like the way he puts it. He says, one may leave the city in search of clean air. So if one needs to get away from the city, in search of finding a cure for the disease or for a search for clean air, then it should be permissible. And then he goes on maybe like a 200 pages long discussion of how the Islamic legal scholarship can be used to justify that view. And then what is really more significant is that after that we see Abu Saud issuing this fatwa, this legal opinion, that this basically, from this theory, we see it is moving in the direction of application. So it becomes like a mainstream accepted practice that was legally accepted. And that was a very long discussion. I mean, this issue of contagion, whether plague comes directly from God or whether we should look at the intermediaries of, you know, the person-to-person contagion. It is an incredibly, there's a very long tradition of discussion and controversial arguments.
I'm Dave Lundco, history librarian. Have you found any evidence that the plague impeded the expansion of the empire? Which is kind of, you know, opposing what you're talking about, since you're talking about plague following the expansion, but maybe depending on the direction and the timing, it could have an effect.
I don't think I have evidence to show it, but there are indications that it might have at least slowed down, because when plague breaks out in the army camps of the Sultan, it might have slowed things down, but I don't have a clear evidence to show that it did have a direct effect. For instance, we know that the plague broke out in the army camp of Selim when he was trying to, before the conquest of Syria. We have evidence for an outbreak of plague before the conquest of Belgrade. And we have evidence that plague was carried with Ottoman soldiers to Tabriz. So there is evidence that it might have had effect on killing soldiers, but I don't really know if there is a case that can show us directly that it was so. It would be very nice to find evidence for it, but I don't have anything to say.
I'm Ricardo Bolaños. I'm a first-year graduate student in the history department. My question is, if you see any specific state measures or emerging institutions or already existing religious institutions that are representative of this pre-modern public health.
Yes, even though we see just the initial formation of some of these institutions, perhaps that will take shape in the later centuries, I think there is evidence to argue that the Ottoman state is now trying to carve out a space for itself and trying to monitor and control the health of individuals. And there is like several sources of evidence to support this. And looking at the implementation of some initial measures to keep cities clean and to keep cities under control at times of outbreaks. Also looking at the beginning of health institutions and a medical establishment during this time. Looking at how the state is now trying to directly control the health of individuals, at least the health of the members of the military class. For instance, a soldier, if he was not able to participate in a military campaign, had to go to the local judge, to Qadi, and to show that he was disabled or he had a health condition, and he had to register with the judge. And in some cases, even later in the 16th century, we see the presence of medical experts in court cases related to the health of individuals. I mean, all of these examples at least suggest to me that now the state is trying to develop some control over the health of its individuals. If for the case of individuals and also for the health of communities. Earlier today we talked about how the Ottomans started to implement new public health policies to contain disease. But I mean, how effective these measures were is, of course, is something that we can debate. I don't think they were very successful or they were very effective in containing the disease. But I think it's very significant that we see the development of these ideas. And also, I think it also has something to do with the circulation of new ideas of contagion throughout the Mediterranean world. I mean, in Renaissance Italy and in Spain, we see evidence that scholars are now trying to revisit ideas of contagion that they have inherited from the ancient Greeks. I mean, not only in the writings of Fracastro, but also others. There is a general trend during this period, and I'm talking about roughly 16th century or so, that new ideas of contagion are spreading all over the Mediterranean world. And we see an interaction of scholars going back and forth between Ottoman cities and Italian towns, and also Jewish immigrants coming from Spain, and mostly doctors. So we see interaction of new ideas, and we see that the ideas of contagion found their way into the scholarly writings of the Ottoman medical elite in the 16th century. And also perhaps the new notions of containing disease and implementing a public health policy might have also some relationship with these new ideas.
Teodora, the Museum of History Department. I was wondering, while we were talking about these medical professionals, what is a medical professional in the Ottoman Empire during this time period? What is their training? Are they theoreticians? Are they practitioners? And I mean, are these people who work in Istanbul, or are these people who work in the regional centers? And I'm still trying to make sense of the Ottoman state's attitude to the plague. Because I mean, I'm really puzzled by the fact that you have so few references coming from administrative sources. I mean, to me that would suggest lack of policy, but you seem to be arguing that there is a policy developing. So I'm wondering, I mean, are these local initiatives, are these local responses in the regional centers, in these urban centers that are emerging as responses to the same problem in different centers? Or are these centrally driven responses? I mean, how do we even start to talk about public health policy if the state in its records has no mention of the plague to begin with, right?
Okay.
So I'm sort of curious to see how you handle these things theoretically.
I mean, I think that's a great question. And, of course, perhaps the lack of evidence is also suggestive. But the lack of evidence, what the lack of evidence shows is also open to speculation. But, you're absolutely right in, raising this question, which also is something that I'm dealing with. First of all, when I use the term public health, I feel like that term itself comes as a package with its own connotations, and it's really too strong to use. And I am in search for a better word in terms of a new terminology that will indicate just an initial attempt to implement something. And I still think that this initial, whatever it was, is significant enough to be taken into consideration, even though we don't see it in the official language of the court documents. And again, it was something that we were talking earlier today. When we look at the language of these official documents, looking from the perspective of the state, they're not really concerned about the well-being or the health of the individuals. At least this is what the language of the documents suggests. They are interested in collecting taxes and in military campaigns and expansion. And of course, securing the taxes is the main issue. And they also want to keep supplies in cities to prevent social and urban unrest. So the priorities of the state are probably not arising from motives that would, but I think it is still significant enough to see the beginning of some of these ideas. Perhaps the scale is different, but some of the ideas that we tend to associate with the development of the early modern and modern state, especially with reference to its move towards the health of individuals and communities. And I think we see something similar here, even though it might be on a smaller scale. And I mean, I think it's still, I mean, I don't have a clear-cut answer to the question of, can the state be undertaking these measures, whereas we don't see a clear policy? I think we see the development of these as just, in a way coinciding with each other. I mean, probably my impression is that probably there was a crisis first, so they had to do something about the crisis, so they adopted some ad hoc measures. We don't even know if they worked or not. And then over time, we have some medical and religious knowledge to explain it, and so the policies that were adjusted were probably over time justified in the literature, and perhaps not the other way around. But if you look at the individuals who are doing this work, perhaps the ones who are making the policies and who are bringing the new knowledge and disseminating the new knowledge are probably the same individuals. So we're basically talking about a smaller circle of elite, and we're not really talking about different circles of people. So that's just my way of looking at it. But your question still remains unanswered.
If I could just make one suggestion, I think the Ottoman Empire and very likely other Muslim, pre-modern Muslim states, I think they had, by their own lights, a sort of welfare orientation or welfare policy, and I can tell you specifically how I discovered this. The Office of the Imperial Diwan, one of its subdivisions was the Takvir Kalemi, and they produced something called the Takvir Death.wmv, and at a stage in my research I had to start reading those things, or at least I thought I did. And I discovered, first of all, they're very hard to read, but the solution to that problem was that they were very repetitive. Mostly it was the same, basically 2 or 3 kinds of warrants that were transcribed into the registers over and over again, just the names and dates different. But the vocabulary was very strange, and I had to look up all these words. And one of the things I discovered in there was something called Death.wmv, which amounts to, well, in medieval European kingdoms, in medieval England, these were known as beadsmen's pensions, the pensions that were given to people just for prey for the king. And they were assigned out of major escrow just to give people incomes out to pray for the continuation of my life and state, hopefully it's working. And so this is how I discovered empirically that the Ottomans, within the limits of their capabilities, maintained a kind of welfare state. And we see other signs of this kind of welfare orientation too. There's certainly in this urban centers, there's what the French scholars call edilité, these public works that relate to providing urban infrastructure. And in Istanbul, there's this elaborate concern to bring water into the city. And if you found dead horses in the reservoir, stuff like that, that would get them going. And and in the treatises that Alan Mikhail talks about in Egypt, and who knows if they produced exactly the same type of treatises in Istanbul, but the scholars could have read the same works. And Ottomans, sultans collected the best Arabic manuscripts anyway. One of the sort of pre-modern plague measures that he finds discussed in there is the idea that it has something to do with the Nile water. In the case of these treatises from Egypt, and maybe you should do things like skim your water, or move, decant it from one vessel to another, or put it in unglazed earthenware things to let it transpire, or or things settle out and you skim off the top. So there are, the Death.wmv is an early form of welfare state. And these other things are sort of like implications that the sort of welfare orientation which of course philosophically is valorized by the idea of the circle of justice. These are sort of signs that there would be at least a motivation there to try to do things within the realm of, within their capabilities to provide for public welfare in instances like this. So I think there's more to it than that. And it wasn't just taxes and warfare.
I think you're right in suggesting that the welfare, we can see indications that there are new establishments and institutions being undertaken in new buildings, and all the caravansarais and homes and commercial buildings, as well as other undertakings to provide for the city population. And I do agree that it again goes back to the nearest state building tradition and the circle of justice. But at least looking at the language of the document, I don't see that as a major source of concern, but I think, looking at what they did, and especially water is a great example, and I had it in mind to talking about the water issue, because it seems that the investment in providing clear water sources for the city and keeping the water clean has been a major concern for Suleiman especially, but in the 16th century in general. And in archival documents, there is a special emphasis in trying to keep water resources clean. And so anyone who's building a house that will contaminate the city waters would be removed, punished, etc. So, and it's not even directly related to plague. And in a way, it suggests to me that these initial measures that started out as ad hoc measures to deal with plague, that kind of grew into a more general public health or pre-modern public health policy. And in that, it certainly goes hand in hand with other ventures that show that welfare is an important dimension of.
Yeah, I was thinking about the tension that Theodora was talking about. We can have our cake and eat it too here. We can have a very tentative. We can't really talk about the play. We don't mention his name. It's kind of something that happens, and we can have this welfare pre-modern public health function. They're not necessarily, when they're doing these things, they're not aiming at plague. They're just aiming at
the general,
the miasma, or the smells, or this, or the general understanding of what needs to do to keep conditions a little better. They're not really aiming. So they don't talk about the plague. They don't have a policy about the plague, but they have a policy about improving the general. So I assume that might be the simple resolution to that more tension.
I have a suggestion too. The sultans could take all sorts of measures, and justify them by taking care of the young army and huzur sometimes is added to that, tranquility, peace of people. But basically, what they intervened into is actually basically putting everything back to its place when something is removed from it, whether we're talking about rights or duties or position or whatever. But they obviously don't say, still find it in the criminal destiny. It's not that it has to discover a special kind of destiny that will reveal the truth about flag. But if they're not in Nukhet Varlik, they're not in Nukhet Varlik, and that's very significant, and that it should be taken seriously. Where are the Umur-e-Din Dawlat, the affairs of the state and religion are still affairs of the state and religion. They cannot move outside of the sphere of politics, no matter what the issue is, unless the person comes to the Sultan and asks him to act upon just about everything. So they don't do that. Why? Perhaps the discussion should now be moved into the sphere of human bodies and discussing the public and private in that context. Because the Sultan has, does he go there in protecting the order and the well-being of the people of the empire, which he is entitled to do and has authority to do, or religious scholars that say will take care of that. The other thing is also that all of the land in the Ottoman Empire belongs to the Sultan, right, or Muslims, or whichever way you define it, except the urban space. The urban territory is privately owned. And we know in other aspects of, for example, economy, the guild self-rule and so on, that the sultans, especially with, except perhaps in the case of Istanbul, does not actually have that much authority over the affairs of the cities and what's going on in there. And then, of course, in addition to that, it's the privacy of home, which you can find hundreds of hadiths or treatises on that, privacy of human body, of human residence, and so on. Of course, this may sound all very artificial sort of interpretation. However, it is very much present in legal discourse, both of the legal scholars, meaning Islamic legal scholars and practitioners, which is one aspect of law, and then also the Qanun does not mention, it does only briefly discuss corporal punishments in some aspects which are never applied. You can never find them in another sources, but they're there with Qanun. So I think, this absence is speaking of perhaps sultans, the limits of sultans' interference in
I think that's a great point, and I have one evidence to support it. When it comes to the body of the individual and the authority of the sultan, and say on it. For instance, when the janissaries are elected from the provinces and then brought to the Ottoman towns, and the young children were given to Muslim families for training and education, what we call the Ajami Olana, and those were directly the property of the Sultan, right? Because they were slaves, theoretically speaking. And when they died of plague, the family had to go to the court to have their death registered. In fact, it's funny. In theory, I guess everybody could go to the qadi, to the judge, to have their death registered. But when you look at the death registers, you only see that people died of plague if there is if it caused a legal problem, and mostly matters of inheritance would be the issue. But in the case of Ajami Hollander, the Janissaries, we see that the families had to register. So perhaps it just, it's a great way of finding out about the occurrence of plague for me, but not other individuals. And also for the health of the members of the military class, because it has something more of relevance. So when we talk about the body of the individual and the legal standing
because they are part of the
Alan, you have a question?
Given that quarantine is a late response to the plague, not until the 19th century, and that evacuation was one of the common responses, and given that you have lots of different situations to deal with over a long period of time, are there any implicit or explicit patterns of evacuation of these population centers? As people try to go to the high country, where there are fewer people but somehow better air, do the people in the rural areas have any means of resisting populations coming at them out of the cities? That ties them to the question of who owns the land and whether the movement on the land. Are people prohibited or encouraged to go on the trade routes in order to leave cities? Does the military play some role in assisting or constraining evacuation? So I just wonder if there are any implicit or explicit patterns that you can identify over this long period.
Well, definitely some indications for the implicit patterns of evacuation, but again, the information is just so scattered, and I don't even know if I have like a precise pattern to point out as to where people were moving to and what it was all taking place, how it was taking place. But there is indication that at least the imperial dynastic family and the upper class elite were moving from towns, especially during the summer when the bubonic plague cases seem to increase dramatically. And as long as there is plague, the Sultan and the court, and most of the time the army, if they were on a military expedition, would not return to the capital, just waiting out for the plague to die out. And there are several instances of that that's just kind of clearly documented in the sources. And as for other towns other than Istanbul, there seems to be this kind of acquired wisdom of moving away from flatlands, lowlands for the highlands for summertime. I mean, in most of Anatolia, this is kind of part of the yearly seasonal routine, and moving to the yayla, to the plateau, was something that was practiced. And we see some evidence that people were avoiding towns during the summer, and this might be related to disease, but perhaps not. But I don't have a precise pattern for the movement. But there is clearly, there are indications that people did, if they could, they did.
And the military, does it play any role in assisting or constraining or educating?
I mean, I wish there were detailed accounts about these. No, I mean, all I have to do is just infer from a line in a source. Unfortunately, no. I mean, I don't think we know enough about the issue to be able to say anything about it.
How were bodies disposed of? Who was in charge of that? The state or individual localities?
Yeah, I mean, for the outbreaks in Istanbul and also some in Bursa and Edirne, I can say that the city was now, the state is trying to implement some measures in disposing of the cities. First of all, I think the growth of communal graveyards in Istanbul itself and the removal of these graveyards outside the city wall is something that corresponds with Istanbul's experience of plague. And I'm pretty sure that there is a connection there with the plague. Of course, not only the city was growing in terms of its population, but also times of plague created this crisis of how to dispose of bodies and what to do with them. And so they started this initial regulation that at times of plagues, all bodies had to be taken outside of city walls. And this is how we see the beginning of the communal graveyards outside the city walls in Istanbul. And then there was another regulation later on that said that even if when there was no plague, all bodies had to be removed outside the city walls. In some other cases that, other examples that I found in the archival documents, for instance, I remember one document that used the gypsy labor for the burial of plague victims, and that's one of the rare examples that I came across in archival documents. There is also indication that they were using lime over the, I mean, that's kind of common practice everywhere. But there is some indication that the state is now controlling that process as well.
Dan? Oh, yeah, Scott.
It's Scott Levi from the Department of History. Returning back to your sources, I'm very sympathetic to the anguish that you go through as you dig through piles of archival records, trying to find that one piece of golden information that you can use to really build an argument. But I wonder if you've had any luck in investigating external sources from outside of the Ottoman Empire. And here I'm thinking of the Seyahat-name, as we're talking about so many, especially Central Asians, making the pilgrimage through Istanbul on the way down to the Hijaz. There's a rich genre of literature, and outsiders tend to have, these sources have inherent weaknesses, of course. But they also tend to make record of things that people who are local don't normally, they just take for granted.
Absolutely. Yes, you're absolutely right. And I do use foreign observers that who visited the Ottoman lands. There is a very rich genre, as you pointed out, especially among the European travelers coming to the Ottoman Empire. And we know that the numbers of travelers that visited the Ottoman Empire grew exponentially after the conquest of Constantinople, but especially in the 16th century. So a major source of evidence comes from these sources, but of course they have their own inherent problems.
Right. What about doctors? What about European doctors coming into Istanbul? Are they leaving records as to what
For the period that I'm working on, there is not much, but there are a few references. And also it reminds me that I did not answer your question about the doctors. Yeah, I mean, just, very briefly, talking about the doctors and the medical establishment itself. And I think this is also related to the efforts of the state in doing all sorts of other things. Up until the 16th century, or the middle of the 16th century, the medical practitioners in the Ottoman Empire itself are mostly either self-taught individuals or continuing practitioners, continuing family traditions, mostly Jewish of origin, but also Christians as well. Muslims too, especially in the 15th century, they were educated in medical schools of Cairo and Syria. So we have some coming from the east, some coming from the west, and among them we have some doctors, well, some medical practitioners who claim to be medical doctors, and now the Ottomans are trying to impose some regulation into their practice in like 1570s or so. I remember some regulations for an attempt to licensing all medical practitioners, be it foreign or Ottoman subjects, and then they implemented some regulations for having them take exams, and if they passed the exam, they would have their licenses. There were several types of them, and there was not a centrally organized medical institution until the mid-16th century. Some had their own individual practice, what they called the tabip dükkanları, and some were just working, itinerant doctors working on the street. But I believe we see that the first medical school in the Ottoman Empire dates back to the mid-16th century with Süleymaniye Mosque Complex. We see the building of Süleymaniye Dar Shifa, and in it there is a medical school. Even though there is a general consensus in the scholarship that the Ottoman medical learning dates back to an earlier date, they seem to assume that medical education was being taken care of, was being practiced in hospitals, but there is actually no clear evidence that it was so. And all the medical practitioners are coming from outside sources. So there is no systematic education in the Ottoman Empire, medical education, until the mid-16th century. Even after the opening of the first medical school, it takes a while for the Ottoman scholars becoming, rising to the top of that medical organization, and of course, the number of Ottoman-trained medical professionals increased over time to such an extent that by the end of the 17th century, it almost completely replaced the foreign Jewish, Christian, and Muslim. So there was what I see as a conscious effort to replace them and to produce their own medical establishment. But the state is very much active in appointing the chief doctors of a hospital in the province and switching them around and promoting that. There are plenty of evidence in the archival documents about their position appointments, and sometimes there were complaints about them, so the state had a direct control over those. And also there was the court physicians, but that's just the...
Okay. Two more questions, I think, that I can see. Sir.
I'm Kim McCall from Economics. Were any of the plagues of antiquity, in particular the Athenian plague of the 4th century BC, considered bubonic, or were they? Was the Black Death a unique?
Well, I mean, that's a question that is beyond my expertise, but I can comment on your question from what I know from the secondary literature. And I think now, relatively, there is a growing consensus among scholars that the Justinianic, what we know of the Justinianic plague, was an epidemic of bubonic plague because of the evidence that we have, the archaeological evidence.
So Justinianic?
The Justinianic plague that started in the mid-6th century and continued until the mid-8th century. And we see instances of this happening all over the Near Eastern geography, and even there is evidence that it moved towards Europe and even in Central Europe graveyards.
Including this genetic evidence that I didn't know about until I read
Yes.
Yeah, so there's actual hard genetic evidence for bubonic plague.
Even in southern Germany, which is fascinating to
600 AD or so. Yeah.
Starting in 542, I believe, and then continued until the 750s or so.
AD.
Dan.
Yeah, I'll try to make this quick. I know we're out of time. You mentioned that you don't develop the point that the Ottoman Empire came to be seen in Europe as a plague exporter. Well, this is in the same period, of course, especially after the conquest of Constantinople, when the Ottoman Empire was perceived to be and was in fact a real military threat as well. And there were lots of treatises written in the West about this threat. So I guess the question is there any connection here between the threat of the Ottoman Empire as a disease center and the threat of the Ottoman Empire, of course, as for Islamic religion, the spread of Islamic religion and as a military threat? Any connection?
Well, I mean, of course, you know, it is beyond the scope of my study. It probably is something that we see. I mean, the perception of the Ottoman Empire and Ottoman lands as exporter of disease is something that develops much later in Europe. And I think it has something to do with the military as well as political and economic superiority of Europe at that time. And so seeing Ottomans in an inferior position and perceiving the Ottoman Empire as the sick man of Europe, perhaps, you know, retrospectively contributed to the perception of the Ottoman cities as exporter of disease. But of course we need to think about the establishment of the quarantine institutions, and the Ottoman Empire did not implement a systematic quarantine institution until 1838. And even then it was very much something imposed by European states. But whether the quarantine measures were effective in dealing with the occurrence of plague in the Ottoman Empire is another question. But I think there is a connection there.
Well, just a very quick follow-up. Sick man of Europe. When does that notion begin? Maybe part of it.
That's
1840s, Tsar Nicholas I of Russia, and initially it was in the form of the initial form of the phrase was the sick bear.
If I may
That's my
suggest
understanding of it.
with this question, Daniel's question, actually for such interpretations of Ottoman menace, both as a military power and as some kind of divine punishment in terms of its orationes contra turcos. That's where we find the repertoire about Ottomans being interpreted astrologically and in all sorts of ways. The genre that was actually, I mean, you can follow probably from 15th century on in Europe, in Venice and so on, and most of them are actually published.
But, you know, what's really fascinating is to hear the repetition of the same discourse, not by the contemporaries, but in modern scholarship, when you hear the same discourse being circulated in modern scholarship. That's when it gets really frustrating.
Well, on that note of frustration, so, thank you very much.